So good morning class, I hope you're all well. Thank you for joining me today. The colours you're going to need are yellow ochre, burnt sienna, alizarin crimson, cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue, and a tiny bit of Payne's grey as well a little bit later on for the eye and a little bit of shadow on the belly of this field mouse. So here's the reference image. Hopefully you've all had time to transfer your picture down. Now I'm not sure how clear that is on screen because I have rubbed away at my pencil lines a little bit because I didn't want them showing through on my painting. But as we go through the painting, hopefully that will become clear to you. So to begin with, in my palette, the brushes, if you want to know what size brushes I'm using, number 10, a number 8, a 4 and a 2. Those are the 4 brushes I'll be using. Shouldn't need any more than that. 4 is ample. Possibly won't use all of them actually, but I've got them there ready just in case. So I'll just begin by explaining how we're going to tackle this then. We're going to, well, my idea is to paint this fairly loosely. So everything's been quite controlled actually that I've taught you this far on the course. So I'm going to approach this a little bit differently. I'm not going to worry too much about getting a feather effect, not a feather effect, I beg your pardon, a fur effect on the field mouse. I'm going to create a much more loose approach, and similarly with the rest of the painting as well. So I'm going to let the watercolour do what it wants to do best and see how we go. We can always add a few finishing details to sharpen up aspects at the end if we're not quite happy with it. So a lot of the painting we're going to do today, because of that looseness, I'm going to be doing wet into wet and getting soft edges and things like that. So hopefully you're all comfortable with that technique now. So to begin with then, let me show you the first mix we're going to do. I'm going to take a little bit of water on my palette there, and using my number 4 brush, I'm going to pick up some of the yellow ochre. So I'm going to get a rough wash down across my little field mouse, starting with the yellow ochre and popping a little bit of burnt sienna in there as well, just to get the colour that we need. If I show you the yellow ochre, obviously it's a yellow base, so it's quite a yellow colour. It's nice and pale. If I bring over the reference image, you can see that's way too yellow even as a starting base coat. So to mute it a little bit, we're going to add a touch of burnt sienna. Now remember, your burnt sienna is really strong in comparison to the yellow ochre, so just be careful. Don't take it too far to begin with, just do little bits at a time until you reach a desired colour. Now remember also, I'm going to wet this paper first, so it's going to look a little bit paler than what it does on my test strip, but because it's a base coat, that's absolutely fine. So I'm happy with that. So that's a little bit of yellow ochre and burnt sienna here on my palette. I'm going to take my largest brush, which is the number 10, and I'm going to wet my mouse. Well, I'm just thinking about the edges. Now obviously he has a white belly, so we don't want to paint this base colour on his belly at all, so be careful of that. Hopefully your guidelines will help. So I'm going to wet around his eye as well. I'm going to leave his eye blank. I don't want to paint that yet because he does have a nice highlight there, and if we paint this base coat across the highlight, we're going to lose that. So paint around his eye, also paint around his nose too. So I'm just applying that water where I want this base coat to be. Now if, like me, you have the heating on today, it's really quite cold actually. Today, temperature's dropped, so you'll find this water will dry very quickly, so don't worry. I will probably need to re-wet certain areas as I come along the painting. Don't panic. Now, I did actually get a bit of water in his eye there, so just remove that. Now I'm going to use, I don't want to be too small, so I'm going to use a number 4 brush to apply this base coat, and I'm going to just allow it to run off my brush, painting around his eye. Because we've got that water down, it does want to soften the edges, which is lovely. So I'm painting carefully up to a guideline that I penciled down. It's drying already, guys, so just, if it starts to dry, just get the water back onto the paper again in the areas as you're going. Don't panic, just wet those areas, because you don't want this wash to have any like hard lines to it really, if you can help it, especially on the edges where it meets his fur. You want that to be a little bit softer, where it meets his belly, should I say. So it comes around here somewhere and down here. I've just done some very pale little guidelines to follow. I've actually what's the word? I've done a broken line so that it's not a definite line on my painting. That helps a little bit. Just missed a bit under his eye there. Bring that down. Don't worry if it's not perfectly flat wash, because that's going to add some texture to your mouse. You can probably see that mine's got a little bit of texture going on down here, which is lovely. Just coming down past his little front foot there. Just adding a touch more water as it's dried off down here. So just watch when you put your paint down, you'll know if that area is wet or dry, because if it's wet it'll splay out, and if it's dry it won't move, you'll just have a line of paint. So just you know, just keep mindful of what's happening, and that way you'll have a lovely soft wash. Just wetting some more down here. To the bottom is back foot there. Just touching some of the edges now of his, where it meets his belly. I'm just touching it with my wet brush with the water on it. Just try and encourage it a little bit to soften on those edges. So I'll start getting little cauliflowers along this edge, which is lovely, a nice way of creating a softened shape. Okay. Do the same down here, just touching some water. And I think I'm going to do the same around the top. I think actually this is dry now, so we won't get this effect because that top edge, the paint has dried entirely. So putting water on now just like that won't create these soft edges. So what I might do is just lift away in some areas with a firmer brush and just soften that edge off after. So I've actually, while it's wet, folks, I've put some of the water onto the bottom section of this wash around his back, and it's just giving some softer, lighter areas, and I think that's a really nice effect. And it works well with this loose kind of feel. So I've just used it's a really big brush, it's my number 10 brush, and I've just added, while the paint is still slightly damp, added some little strokes of water, and it just pushes some of that paint out of the way and gives you lighter patches. So while this is continuing to dry, we may as well move on to the next step. So if I'm really careful with my palette, I'm going to show you the colour for the rose hips. So just wash my brush off. And we're using the crimson for this. And I'm going to pick up, now crimson is really, really strong, very strong colour indeed, especially this artist quality paint. You don't need a lot of it at all, it's really strong. And also something to bear in mind, crimson is a staining colour, so whatever you do, don't splatter it across your painting. You won't be able to lift it off the surface, it will stain the paper. So I am going to shift my palette out of the way just in case I get spots. So I've got a little bit of crimson there on my palette, and if I show you on the scrap paper, I've actually got, it's quite a dark mix, isn't it? But it's fairly close to what we want. Now what I'm going to do is have a secondary section with crimson in over here, and I'm going to add, let's just get that down, I'm going to add a little bit of our ultramarine blue into that, just to change it slightly. It will darken it up a little bit, just a touch of blue. Oh, that was a lot of blue. So not quite as much blue, folks. Let's get some more crimson in there, bring it back a bit. So I'd already activated my ultramarine there, and that's why I ended up picking up too much. There we go, that's better. So what you want is something that's slightly darker. You can see how rich that is. It's much more like a red wine colour, I suppose. And that will use simultaneously the two colours together, again wet in wet, so they'll come out a little bit lighter. So again, taking my larger brush, number 10 brush, and obviously we want to work first of all on this left hand rose hip, because you might, your little mouse might still be slightly damp, so work on this left hand rose hip first. Wet the area. It's split in half nicely because it's got that shape cutting through it. So if you do the left hand half first, just get that water on, and I'm going to start off with the crimson on its own, and I'm going to place that down. Look how it splays, it's absolutely beautiful in that water. It's already started to dry at the top here, that's how quickly it dries. So I'm just going to get this down. I'm going to fill the space with this crimson, just being a bit careful along that edge of that shape that's cutting through. So that's all down, and now it's still damp, quickly into the darker colour. Just have a look where it's dark. Now there's a bit of cast shadow behind the shape that's running through it, so a bit of a cast shadow down there with this darker colour, and it is darker on this left hand side as well on the edge, so just place that down. You see how the two colours are blending together nicely. And that's what we want, the wet into wet. It's the paint's doing the work for us, and it gives us that nice blend of colours going through, and that's exactly what I'm going to do on the right hand side. And I'll speed the process up a little bit for you so this video isn't too long. So while they're completely drying, I'm going to move on to the leaves at the top, and let's mix up a green. Now I'm going to have a go actually first of all using some of this yellow ochre and the ultramarine blue, and just see if it gives us a green that we can use, because I like to continue, I like to use a limited palette, and if we can get away with using the yellow ochre for the green, then we will. Now actually it's doing what I thought it was going to do, and that's producing this very mucky kind of grey green, so that's no good. Okay, that's fine. So I did say that we'd be using the cadmium yellow, so that's what we'll do. So I've got cadmium yellow here. Look at that lovely bright colour. And the green we want, if you look at the image, is really quite a zingy green. So we want a really good yellow base, and we only need a little bit of the blue because we want it quite light, quite zingy. So I'll just take a touch of my blue there, and I'm getting quite a nice colour. Just take my little piece of paper and show you that. So that isn't far off what we need. There are some slightly darker green areas, so what we'll do, again, we'll use the wet and wet technique, and we'll use the two colours simultaneously. So I want to mix up a slightly darker section as well. So let me just clean off that mucky colour that I had a go with. That wasn't going to work for us. Let's mix another green over here. Again, start with your cadmium yellow. There we go. And then the ultramarine blue. And this time we want to make a darker green, so that actually looks pretty good. So just do a bit at a time, folks, just a little bit of blue at a time, because it's really strong compared to the yellow. Now those two greens are really nice. So the type of green I wanted now was something similar to this section of the leaf, and we can see that it is. That's lovely. Now there's also these kind of orangey browny sections that you can see here and here, but I think what we'll do is we'll stick to let's make it simple for ourselves. Let's just use the two colours to begin with, allow that to dry, and come back in a bit later on and add some detail with the orangey brown tones on top. Otherwise we're going to be working super fast and we might get a bit stressed, and we don't want a stressful environment. We want to be creating a nice relaxing painting environment. So let's just slow it down a bit and just do the two greens to begin with. So exactly the same way as approaching the other two items that we've already done. I'm going to wet the areas first. My mouse is completely dry there, so I know whatever I do now isn't going to encroach on him at all, as long as I don't wet him with this big brush. So I'm going to start actually on this right hand leaf. It's got nice sort of jagged edges, which is lovely, so I want to try and preserve that, the edge of the leaf there. It gives us some interest on the leaf. And it comes to about here. Just a little note, I've actually altered this slightly on the image. This looks like one leaf, but the central vein is right up here. So to me that doesn't work. The left hand side of the leaf is really thin, the right hand side is huge. So what I've done is I've split this up into two leaves. I have basically stopped that leaf about here, and then I've got a second leaf kind of underneath it. So I'm going to effectively paint two leaves in that section. It'll make sense, I hope, once I paint it. So I've painted the top area up to this first line here, that edge of the leaf there. So you've got the vein in the middle, and then I've created an artificial line here for the other edge of that leaf. So I'm going to paint that in now. So I've wet it, and because I've been chatting away, it's dried. So I'm just going to re-wet it again. There we go. And I'm going to, actually, I'm going to pick up a bigger brush. So this one is a number 8 round, just damping the bristles down. And I'm going to go into the lighter yellow first. Just get, basically like we did before, I'm just going to put that lighter colour down. And then I'm going to come in with a bit of the dark. Just add a bit of water to that. So that's the basic shape of my leaf. And now I'm going to go into my darker green, and I'm just going to, oh, that's really quite dark. So into a bit of water to lighten it down a little bit. And then I'm just going to pop it here and there. Again, like I say, I want a loose effect, so really don't be too fussy about where you put it. You just want a general change of colour. We've got 2 tones going on, 2 greens, a light and a dark at the moment, and that is enough, I think, for that leaf. It's behind the mouse. We don't want to draw too much attention to it, so it's out of focus, hence the wet on wet technique. But we can come back in later and we can paint in a few veins, and that'll be enough description for that leaf. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the second leaf here on the left hand side now. Again, I'll speed this process up for you so you can just watch it really quickly and then paint your own. Now I've completed the top 2, I'm going to move on to this lower leaf behind the stems of the rose hips. Okay, so I continue to paint the leaves and I think they're great now. What we'll tackle next is the head of the rose hip here. So there's some lovely texture that we're going to create in the centre there. And what I want to do is tie in some of the colour from the field mouse. So I've still got quite a lot of that base colour left here, which was the brown colour that I'd put on my sample card there. So I've got that already mixed. You'll have to mix up a little bit more if you used all of yours. But at the same time, we're going to do this wet in wet technique again. I want to create a darker version of that. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of the yellow ochre, which is how we started the lighter one. So a bit of yellow ochre, but this time much more of the burnt sienna. So we want to create a darker brown, but actually that brown isn't dark enough, so we're going to have to go into a bit of the ultramarine blue to cool it down a bit and darken it up, and we should get something that's much more suitable. I want to mix up a little bit more than I've got, so a bit more of the blue, and then back to the burnt sienna. There we go. So if you paint your darker brown on top of what you've already got on your tester sheet, that will signify the difference in those tones. So we're going to use the lighter brown and this darker brown on the heads of the rose hips. Well, it's only the one, isn't it? There's some beautifully twisting shapes coming off, and of course the field mouse is grabbing hold of that. So it's a really nice feature of the painting. What I'm going to do, as before, I'm going to take my brush and apply some water first. This time I've gone down to my number 8 rather than my number 10 because some of these are quite small. And let me think now, because we've got long tendrils coming off, wetting this all in one go, it's not going to work, it's going to dry. Let's see, let's just do the centre first. Don't want any hard lines forming while we're trying to paint the little tendrils. So if we do the centre first with water and extend that water beyond the centre, that way you won't get hard lines, you'll have some soft lines to deal with. So oh yes, I've got my dark colour on my brush, so I'm just cleaning that off now, and I'm going to go straight into the lighter colour. And oh, it's drying already, my goodness. Wow, that top section that I wet first is already dry, so it's worth spending some time getting that water down. So luckily I've been able to save it, because the important part, the bottom part, I wet last, so that's okay. So if I leave that now, go back to my water, can you see how that is all softened there? So that gives me time to drag some water down these shapes. Oh, I'm going to revert to a smaller brush here because I don't want any of this to go into my red. And I'm going to go and pop down some more of that lighter colour. Okay, so I want this to be nice and loose, remember. So I'm going to go into the dark now and dab in some of that dark colour around that centre section. Leave some little gaps in between, so it is going to splay, it's going to move further than where you place it. So if you leave a few gaps in between your little dots, you'll get some of the light shining through. And then I'm going to just bring some of the dark down this section as well. Not everywhere, just here and there, because it's nicely textured. So you've got some lights and some darks there. And again, I want this loose feel, so don't need to be too finicky about it. Is this water? Yes, so on my little brush I can go back and put some more water down on this section now. Okay, and then dab off that dark, go into my light. Then into the dark. You can even darken up some more of that centre. as it's drying. So I want some really dark bits in here, so I've just really darkened up my mix there. Adding some of that in, and obviously as it dries it continues to splay out into that wet paint around it. So just remembering to clean that really dark off my brush now, and then back with my water brush, and then I'm going to come up here and paint this section next. So water first. Okay, so now you know, leave that, see how far you've got. Once it's dry, you'll be more able to tell if you need to work on it anymore, but I'm quite happy with the way that's drying there. Next I want to work on the second coat of our mouse. So I've still got my pale colour, which was this colour. Now the second colour I'm going to use is basically what we just mixed, that darker colour. So I've pretty much run out on my palette, so I'm going to use the remainder of what I've got here of the light and just make it darker. So bit of the burnt sienna into this to darken it up. I want to make sure I've got enough of this colour mixed as well. I don't want to run out partway through. Again, we're doing this wet on wet. I want it really, really loose, guys. Don't be too finicky. We're not worrying now about, like we, which painting was it we did where we painted it was the fox, wasn't it? We were working on details of edges, little flicks and things like that. This is a different kind of feel that I want to create here, much looser. So we're going to use nice wet paint, and we're going to have areas of this light shining through. A little bit of the blue just to knock it back a bit, because if you just use the burnt sienna, it's very, very warm, and actually if we look at the mouse, it's quite a cool brown, you know, it's a dusty kind of brown. So a little bit of blue in there just knocks it back a little bit and gives us a much better colour. So before we even apply any paint, I'm going to wet the mouse again. So it might be best if you work in sections this time. So I'm going to start on the head. I'm going to wet the head area and put the paint down, and then wet the next area, and then finally the bottom section. So this way we don't need to work quite as quickly. So again, I'm not going to paint the eye, I'm not going to paint the nose. Okay, so don't want any of this water to run into either of those sections. So really careful around the eye. I'm just going to paint to about there with the water, just up to the start of his ear, and then it shouldn't disturb what's beneath, because just be very gentle and it shouldn't disturb what you've got beneath. Now I'm going to paint some of this darker on top, and I want to let some of that light come through. But I'm using a smaller brush this time, so this is my number 4 brush. So before I did it with a huge brush, didn't I? The first wash of colour. This time I'm using a smaller brush, which means that I can control it a little better and I can get lots of that light coming through. I'm just going to put a bit more down here, a bit more on the edges there. You can do a few flicks if you want, I suppose, at the edge, but you know, don't be too finicky about it. You want to get this on wet on wet. Okay, so that's about as far as I went with the water, so I'm going to go back to my wetting brush and apply more water down his back. Now, if you look at your reference image all the time as well, there are lighter areas across him, so try not to put this colour everywhere. You want to keep some lighter areas, like the back, sorry, the top of his head is a little bit lighter, so this colour kind of comes to in front of his ear, and then he has quite a light, the top of his head is light. Obviously the light is hitting him there, so that's why we get that effect. There's a bit of dry paper there, so I'm just popping some water down. So yeah, just go in this motion. You can see my brush strokes are going in the direction of his hair as well. That's quite important. You want that. So if I was to paint left and right, it's going to flatten his shape. You don't want to do that. Try and follow the direction of his fur. Now I'm going to use some more water. And he gets quite light around this section, so I want to try and preserve some of that. Look from an angle. If you can't see where you've wet, just look from a slight angle and you'll see where the paper's shiny. That's really useful. It's difficult for me to see because I've got the camera facing down, so I can't look directly above, so I'm struggling a little bit here. But there's definitely a darker section just coming under here, which is like the back of his arm, and it comes around and then about here. So I've left quite a big area there, quite light. But this is where we're getting some shape and form occurring now. So you can see how fast I'm painting. I'm really not being fussy. I know it's difficult to do that. I know it is. It's hard to let go and stop, you know, all that control. But if you do it, you'll just get much better results. So, you know, and at the end of the day, it's just a painting. If it doesn't quite work out, you can have another go. It's just a piece of paper, you know, start again or persevere. Sometimes it's best to persevere, you know. You can transform a painting. But yeah, at the end of the day, just have a bit of fun. Try and be loose with it. And hopefully it will work out for you. So you can see there, hopefully you can see I've got some lights and darks happening across his shape. And I think, oh, I've got a bit of dry paper there. That's why I've got a hard line. So I'm just wetting that section again because it's still damp up there. I'm able to do that. I'm going to come in with a bit of water on his back edge because that's still slightly damp, and drag some of that into that water to soften that a little bit there. That's dried on his head there, but I'm just popping down a bit of water and I'm using my bristles to tickle it, if you like, and just stop it from being quite so, oh, it's a hard edge, you know. You don't want really any of those if you can help it. Okay, right. Let's get his little paws in next. So I'm going to take a clean area of my palette, a tiny touch of the crimson. You want really, really pale colour now. So barely there. I don't know if you can see it on the camera, it's barely there. And I'm going to use that to paint a colour. I'm going to paint it onto obviously the dry paper, and they are small sections. I'm going to paint it with that pale pink first. Might go slightly darker. So I'm going to then use a slightly darker to define the shape. So there are a little bit of darker pinks going on, sort of the shadows and things. So if you get that, if you can use the pink to do that. And then there is a bit more shadow, but we might need to use a tiny bit of the Payne's grey. So I'm going to continue doing his feet. So I don't know if you've noticed, but I haven't, I believe this may be his other foot, but I'm not entirely sure because it's very fuzzy and I'm not sure. So I haven't painted that in, I haven't drawn it in on the image. I suggest that his second back paw is actually lower down and behind this leaf. So I've not put that in my picture. If you want to paint his back foot in there, if you think that's what it might be, then by all means do that. But I don't believe it is. So I'm not entirely sure what it is, and I think it's fine without it. So therefore I haven't added it into mine. Okay, let's just pop some shadow down here. Okay, that's all we need to do for his feet. Next, I want to paint in the stems of the rose hips. So going back, I've still got some of my brown mixed up, but actually looking at it, it's kind of got browns in there, but also a base of a green. So if you still have your darker green mixture, then we can use that. Just mine had dried in my palette, so I've just wet it and reactivated it again. Now we want it to, obviously it needs to stand out in front of this leaf from behind, so we need to make sure that it's darker than that so that it stands forward. So I am going to add in more of the ultramarine blue, a bit more of the yellow, and then I'm also going to add some touches of brown as I'm painting them. So let me just check that it's dark enough. If I put it down the side here, yeah, that should stand in front. And if I also add some brown to it, that will help as well. Now, if these aren't particularly big, but if you don't want any hard lines and if you paint slower, then, you know, by all means wet it first. I think I'm going to be okay painting it on the dry. Let's give it a go. Obviously, when you're painting on the dry, you just need to be quick about it. So I want to add in some of my brown here as well while it's still wet. There we go. Carry that green down. So yeah, I mean, you do have to be fast because you end up with little stripy lines. Just get a bit of water on there. Drag that water up and then into my paint. But like I say, wet it first if you need to, and then pop your paint down. If it's not quite dark enough, you can go in with a second coat. Just going to mix up a bit more of the brown there. Oh, and it's a bit too bright, so some ultramarine blue just darkens it off a touch. There's just some darker specks here and there, and there's some dark on this side as well, which I want to get on there. So I'm not being too faffy fiddly again, I want it nice and loose. Just getting the shadow across there. And let's darken up this bottom section as well. Okay. Perhaps get some more green on it. So you can see it stands proud in front of that leaf. It's definitely darker, and that's what you just need to ensure when you do yours. And that's fine. No need to touch that again. It's got enough detail on it. Now then, we want to look at his belly, and we're going to need to use some Payne's Grey. Oh, I've just realised his leg here, I've not put down any brown here. Let's rectify that straight away. So I'm going to just wet his arm. I can't believe I missed that off. I don't know. Well done to you guys if you have painted that in. I was just looking at his belly and thought, oh my goodness, I've not got his arm in. So let's get some of that paler brown going on. That's fine. I think that's it there. Slightly mottled, so that'll do there nicely. Now I'm going to have to let that dry before I tackle the belly. So now I'm going to look at creating a really pale Payne's Grey, and we will paint sort of the shadows of his fur on his belly next. So that brown section of his front leg has now dried on my painting, so we'll be able to paint up to that, so that's okay. Now you want something that's, obviously it needs to be dark enough to stand out on the white paper, but you don't want it to be too dark. Something like that is perfect. And also we are going to wet the area as well. So I'm going to take my what am I using? Number 8 brush. And let's start down this bottom section actually. I'm going to wet this section. I don't want it to be like soaking wet, just want it to be damp. So pop some water down, smooth it out, just taking care around those objects. And then just have a look at where these shadows are darkest and pop some colour down with your brush, and that's easy. That's, you know, how to go about it. Leave some gaps in between where you put the paint down to let some of the white show through, because we're using this oops, that's dry there, this technique, this loose technique. You don't want to be too worried about it. And that's all I'm going to do there. I'm going to let that dry. So moving up to the next section, carefully pop some water down. If it's really soaking wet, the grey will spread a long distance. If it's just damp, you can control it a little bit more. So it's getting used to knowing the amount of water that's on your paper, and if you look for an angle, that will give you some idea. If it's really shiny, then it's soaking wet. If it's just got a glisten, then it, you know, that's ideal really, because the grey paint won't travel quite as far. So I'm going to take some paint off my brush actually and control it a bit more like that. So my brush isn't quite as full as it was. So not as much paint is coming off my brush now. And it's actually grey all the way down in that section. I'm going to leave that there. So moving my way up, usually I start at the top and work my way down, but this time I think getting that bottom section right was going to help me decide how much shadow to put in up here. Let's have a look. So I'm going to start up here. There's not so much shadow up here, so just little bits on that section. and it's really quite dark under his chin. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually wetting into the brown paint up here, because I want the grey to actually blend a little bit. So let's have a look. Definitely leave some spaces up here. And what I might do is let that dry, and if it's not dark enough, come back with a little bit more, or as it's drying I can add a few more touches. So yeah, I might actually go a bit darker. So let's let the paint move, see how far it's going, and kind of gauge it from there really. So it's not a precise science or anything, to just gauge it yourself, see if you're happy with what you've got. So can you see these marks I'm making here? That's on dry paper, so it's really hard edges. So I'm just going to soften them a little with a tiny bit of water there, just to soften that off again. Yeah, I'm going to let that dry and see what happens. So looking at my reference image, I can actually see that there's some, this here, the shadow there isn't very grey, it's actually much warmer, because I think the colour of the rosehip is sort of being reflected on his chest. So what I'm going to do, what have I got on my brush? Grey. So I'm going to clean my brush. I'm going to wet just this section here a little bit, just damp it down a little bit. I'm going to pick up some of that pink, that's the crimson, and I'm just going to put in a few bits of that in there, just at the top there. And there's a bit just above as well. So let's just pop a little bit down in there too. And what we're doing then is we're just bringing other colours across from the painting into this area, and it helps to tie things together. That's nice. You don't want to go overboard though. Don't start doing the whole thing pink. I think it might look a little bit distracting. And I know there's some pink down here. If you really look closely at things, you start to see the colours emerging from the shadows. So I'm just going to put a little bit here and there. It's really subtle, this. You might not even see it on the camera. I'm working really subtly here. And I know I wanted a loose painting, so I shouldn't be doing things like this. I should have kept it nice and simple. But if I just bring it up to the camera and just stand up and see what you can see. So yeah, hopefully you can see here this sort of pinkish tones, and just very subtly down there too. Just enough, I think. You don't need to, like I say, don't go overboard. Just keep it really subtle. And just to let you know, I've painted his nose in as well. I think I did that off camera, sorry guys. All it is a little bit of the crimson, but actually I'd added some brown into it as well, so it's not too pink. So I've painted his nose in there. And what we also want to do is look at painting his eye and getting some detail of his ear as well. So let's do the ear first. Clean my brush off. Right, so I need to bring some brown into the front of his ear shape. So let me just show you what I mean. So this is the outline of his ear, like the edge of his ear, the tip of his ear, that curve, like that rainbow curve there. But the inside of that ear is darker brown, and on my painting it's quite light. So I need to, first of all, just wet around it because I don't want hard lines. And I'm just bringing in a little bit of that brown because this defines the ear a little bit. So that's the inner ear that I've painted in there. I'm just bringing some of that brown down into the rest of his head as well. A little bit there. Again, I've wet that area. I haven't gone in on dry paper. I've wet the area that I'm painting just because it keeps it nice and subtle. Let's have a look. Also, his cheek's a little bit darker here, so a little damping down of that area, and I'm just going to darken it a touch there. Very subtle, but there we go. So we've got more of a shape of his head. That looks better. Now let's see, there is slightly darker actually behind his ear, so again a little bit of water down, and this is very pale, this brown, but it is darker than what I've already got in that area, so you will see it. And just pull that across that section a little bit. So now I can see the shape of his ear. I've actually just noticed that there must have been some water going into his ear shape, so I've just cleaned that up. Didn't want that dark brown there. That's better. So now hopefully you can see his ear. Okay, very subtle, but it makes all the difference. Now then, when it comes to tackling the eye, we're going to do this in stages. So obviously his eye is really dark, but actually I'm going to start off with a very pale Payne's grey, and I'm going to paint the Payne's grey across the eye. Try and leave the highlight. Don't want to paint the highlight. I'm painting on dry paper. Now ideally I'd want to move my board around to see this properly, but obviously I can't do that with the camera there, so I'll paint this as best I can. Okay, so I've got very pale grey in there. That needs to thoroughly dry now before I do a second coat, because if I show you on the reference image, there is actually a pale line at the bottom of his eye here, and I think without that detail, if we just paint it all in really dark black or grey, his eye's going to look huge for a start, and it's going to look a bit like a cartoon. So I think getting in details like that is really important. So therefore I've got the pale edge painted already, and then when I come in a second with the dark grey mix, we will leave a little bit of a slither of grey at the bottom there to define that edge. Okay, so I'm just going to let that dry before I paint the next section. While the eye is completely drying, I'm going to just look at the nose section of the animal, and on the reference image you'll notice there's sort of little dots and things going on, so let's try and add that detail. I think what's going to be best is if I've got grey on my brush. That's not going to work. Clean brushes. I'm just going to wet that area around his snout, and I'm going to come into my palette. There's sort of browns here and there, so if I bring this all together, there we go. I'm just going to sort of pop some little dabs of this here and there. It might be a little bit wet actually, it's spreading quite a lot, so drying it off a little bit. Let's get some more, let's get a bit of that brown on there. Just added a bit more paint to that mix of paint there, and yeah, so I'm just dotting this colour on. Hopefully what it'll do is just texturise that front section a little bit for me. Yeah, that's okay, I think. That's dry at the top there, so I've just dabbed that out. Yeah, it just gives it some texture. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just enough. And actually, I'm going to wet. It comes a bit further back close to the eye. So if I wet this section here as well and bring some of that, just a few dots of that darker paint across. Bring in some darks across the top as well. Now you can see how dotty that is because I'm working there on dry paper. So I just take a damp brush, and while that paint isn't quite dry, I can dab some water into that, and it just makes it much more subtle. Okay, so I think that's all I want to do there. I don't want to go too far. It's given him some texture on his nose, which we wanted, and that's fine. So his eye, I believe, is dry. Yes, it is. Now this is where you want to use your number 2 brushes if you've got them, or your thinnest round brush, whatever it is you've got. And we're mixing up this time a much darker grey. If you've got black and not Payne's grey, that's fine, use that. Water it down slightly, don't have it like really, really black. If you add water, it turns it grey. So look at the difference between the light and the dark there. Okay, really big contrast. Now I'm going to try and do this as best I can without moving the camera. I'm going to have to move my chair. I'm going to try and paint this as neatly as I can without moving it around. Now then, so I want to preserve the grey outer rim. So first of all, I'm taking my brush and I'm painting a line in to preserve this bottom edge. Okay. And now I'm just going to paint it doesn't help that my tremor's not very good today. So if you outline it and then bring that colour in, and remember to try and preserve that reflection. Okay, so that looks, let me bring my reference image across. Yeah, I quite like that, that's okay. If yours isn't quite dark enough, you can go a little bit darker, just let it dry first. Put a second coat of your Payne's grey on top until it's nice and dark. Just going to titillate that shape a little bit. There we go. And what I'm also going to do is just paint a little bit of very pale grey at the front section of that reflection, because it's a bit paler, it's a bit grey there, so rather than it all being white, a touch of grey. There we go. And a touch of grey at the back there as well. That's better, just slightly more realistic. Now, of course, we haven't actually added the bit of colour in the leaves, and we haven't painted on any of the veins either. So that's what we'll tackle next. And then I think, really looking at it, I'm happy. Once those details have been added, I think we'll be fine to leave it as it is. So let's get a colour mixed for this nice brown section of the leaf. So if we start with our brown, the burnt sienna, what I'm going to do is, these are very pale, remember, so anything brown on top is really going to stand out, so we don't want it too dark. But what I'm going to do into that brown, I'm going to bring in some crimson as well, because it's got slightly red tones in it. Okay, and then also at the same time I'm going to mix up down this corner some darker brown, so ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and that gives us a darker brown. If you have a look on the reference image, there are some darker brown spots, so we'll just bring a little bit of that in as well. Okay, so sticking with our technique then, we're going to do wet in wet. So taking your clean brush with a bit of water, and I'm going to wet this section, top section of the leaf. And if you're careful, if you just sort of stroke across it 1 or 2 times and being careful, then shouldn't disturb the washes that you put on underneath it. And now I'm going to take, what's this, my number 8. Yeah, I'm going to use my number 8 brush. I'm going to go into the browny red colour that I've mixed and go into that wet section, bring in some of that colour. And if you use the direction of the veins, that's helpful. I'm going to make more of the colour, didn't mix enough, and water it down slightly. There we go. So I've got the general shape first of all, now I'm going back into it with some more colour, slightly darker colour, wetter paint. And then if I use a smaller brush, pick up some of the dark. I'm going to mix up more because I know that's not going to be enough. So there we go. So we've got a dark brown, and I want to pop that in, coming down the centre. And then just maybe 1 or 2 little veins coming off it. Okay. I just want to tidy up the edge that's touching my mouse down here, so just take care around him, and that's pretty good. I could also, what colour have I got on this? My brown. So if I just wet a section down here and come in with some of that little bit of the red, and then some of this darker brown. I I keep forgetting what I've got on my brushes. Oh dear, maybe I need to label them up. So I've got water on this one here, so I just want to make sure that it's all soft. Whatever I put down is softened if it's wet. There we go. So just a touch of something here and there, maybe a little bit more up here. Now I'm fiddling and I need to stop. So if you get to that stage, folks, stop. Oh, there's some lovely red though up there that I haven't got. Let me try and get some more red in that. It's actually more like cadmium red than crimson, but it's crimson that we're using in the painting, so just add some of that red in. Okay. We could make the bottom of his leaf a little bit darker green actually now, because it needs to balance it out a little bit. So what we've done up there suddenly splits the leaf in half. If we actually add some darker green, it's just going to make the whole thing look a little bit more balanced. So bringing in some dark green down here. And then the same, need to do the same really on the other side. The other side's actually much more yellow, so we could add the cadmium yellow over the top a little bit, look, and that just pulls out that yellow. That's nice. Bring in some more of that yellow up here. And maybe a bit more yellow. Ooh, very strong. Sometimes I forget that my paints are so potent. There we go. I bet you're screaming at me, stop, it's it's time to stop. I know. Right, okay, paintbrush down. And then you could, I'm just stepping back a little from the painting. I want to add a little bit of, let's just, right, let's have a look. Let's wet some of this. I want to bring in some of that lovely yellow over to this side because that's worked really nicely. There is some quite sharp yellows in those leaves, which is interesting. So that helps to kind of pull the two together a little bit more. And then if you want to, you could add in little bits of some brown here and there across the leaf as well, just to try and tie some of it together. There's a bit of a darker vein going through it. And then there's a couple of veins kind of coming off it, isn't there? So you can kind of bring that in. And then if they're too strong, just soften them with a little water. That's probably enough up there. Okay, right. I think the rose hips has worked really nicely. Yeah, that's fine. Can you see up here? I've just noticed I'm getting a bit of a tide line, so it's not dried evenly across the leaf, but actually, do you know what, I quite like that effect, so I'm okay with that, which is lucky. I also have 2 cauliflowers here and here on my rose hip, which is beautiful. I really like that too. So what I did was I added a bit of water onto the top of the red paint as it was drying, and what happens is it creates a bloom because those areas are much wetter than the paint around it, so they dry in a different at a different rate, and that's what happens. You get these marks. But I've also got some very soft, subtle blooms going on the left one, which is beautiful too. I think my mouse is detailed enough. I don't think I need to do anything more with the mouse. I'm happy with this. I'm just going to rub out my line here because I was going to do a second leaf underneath this one, but actually, having completed that, I think I'm happy with the way it's turned out. So here he is, the completed field mouse. He's super cute. I've really enjoyed painting him. I hope you have too. If you've got any questions, don't forget, send me an email, or you can get in touch with me on my Facebook page, send me a message there. I'd love to see you finish paintings in my Facebook group as well. It's always really nice to see them and see the lovely comments that you all leave for each other. It's great. So take care, have a lovely week, and I hope to see most of you next week at Stanton Village Hall for the start of my April course. Take care, guys. See you soon.